It's just temporary, Mom. We needed the space, Daniel said, standing in the doorway of the garage on the morning of Margaret Whitmore's 40th wedding anniversary. The words hovered in the cool Ohio air, thin and practical, as if they explained everything. Margaret stood still on the concrete floor, her slippers collecting a faint dusting of sawdust, and looked at the row of cardboard boxes lined up beside the second car. Each one was neatly labeled in Claire's handwriting: linens, photo albums, winter coats. The house behind her, 2,800 square feet of memories, paid off over 3 decades, felt suddenly farther away than the maple tree at the edge of the driveway. She had woken before sunrise that morning, the way she always did on anniversaries, expecting to feel the quiet ache of missing Thomas. 40 years ago, she had walked down the aisle of St. Andrew's Church in a satin dress her mother had altered by hand. 25 years later, Thomas had surprised her with silver roses in their kitchen. Even last year, when his heart had already begun to fail, he had squeezed her hand and whispered, "This house will always be yours, Maggie." Now she stared at the framed wedding portrait resting on top of one of the boxes, the glass reflecting the fluorescent light above the garage door. Claire avoided her eyes, adjusting the strap of her handbag as if they were about to leave for brunch, instead of explaining why Margaret's life had been condensed into 12 medium-sized moving cartons. Daniel cleared his throat. "We thought it would be easier this way," he added, the tone he used when presenting a reasonable solution at work. Margaret nodded once. She did not ask why her closet upstairs was half empty. She did not mention that her winter coat, the wool one Thomas had bought her in Chicago, was folded inside a box labeled Misk. Instead, she stepped closer and ran her fingers over the edge of the cardboard, feeling the ridges pressed gently into her skin. 8 months ago, when Thomas passed, Daniel had insisted on moving back home to help out. Margaret had believed him. She had believed the late-night talks in the kitchen meant comfort. She had believed Claire's suggestion to repaint the master bedroom was about fresh starts. Somewhere between the new security code on the front door and the quiet discussions about refinancing, the house had shifted its center of gravity. Now, standing in the garage that smelled faintly of motor oil and old leaves, Margaret understood that space was not the issue. Space had never been the issue. It was position, visibility, permanence. The anniversary card she had bought for Thomas sat unopened on her nightstand upstairs, its envelope addressed in careful blue ink. She imagined the empty space where her dresser used to stand, the indentation in the carpet already smoothing out. Temporary, she repeated softly, tasting the word as if it were unfamiliar. The garage door hummed open behind her, letting in a band of pale morning light that stretched across the boxes like a quiet verdict. Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply picked up the framed wedding photo and held it against her chest, as if measuring how much of her life could still fit inside her arms. Margaret carried the framed photograph back inside, as if it were something fragile. Even though the glass was thick and the wood frame solid oak, the kind Thomas had insisted on buying because he believed in things that lasted. The house felt different that morning, not louder or quieter, just rearranged in a way that made her steps uncertain. The hallway runner that had once led to the master bedroom now ended at a door that Daniel and Claire had begun calling their room. Her own things, what remained of them upstairs, had been compressed into the smaller guest room at the back of the house, the one that faced the narrow strip of yard and the neighbor's white vinyl fence. 8 months earlier, after the funeral reception ended and the last casserole dish had been picked up from the kitchen counter, Daniel had stood in that same hallway and said, "We cannot let you stay here alone." Margaret had believed the concern in his voice. She had believed that when Claire suggested turning the downstairs office into a playroom for the future, it meant there would be laughter again. In the beginning, the changes were subtle. A new sectional sofa replaced the floral one Margaret had chosen 20 years ago. The family photographs were rearranged so that recent vacation pictures occupied the center of the mantel, while older black and white prints shifted toward the edges. The thermostat setting changed without discussion, adjusted to a cooler temperature that made Margaret reach for a cardigan in her own living room. One afternoon she had returned from the grocery store, arms filled with paper bags, and found a contractor measuring the kitchen island. Claire had explained they were considering a renovation to increase resale value, saying it in the same tone someone might use to discuss repainting a fence. Resale value. The phrase had lingered in Margaret's mind longer than it should have. She had written the final mortgage check beside Thomas at the kitchen table 15 years earlier, celebrating with 2 slices of apple pie from the bakery down the street. They had talked about leaving the house to Daniel someday, when the time felt right, not when it felt convenient. In the weeks after Daniel moved back in, Margaret tried to adjust. She folded her towels to fit into the narrower linen closet Claire reorganized. She moved her sewing basket from the living room corner to the guest room so it would not make the space look cluttered. She told herself that families evolve, that sharing a home requires compromise. But compromise began to look different when she noticed the mail addressed to her was stacked separately, sometimes opened, and placed on the kitchen counter with small sticky notes attached that read for your review. Bank statements were discussed as if they were joint matters. The house that had once echoed with her and Thomas making decisions together now felt like a place where decisions arrived pre-packaged, presented to her with polite smiles. Standing in the guest room that afternoon, Margaret opened one of the boxes Claire had labeled linens and found not only sheets and blankets, but also the anniversary scrapbook she had kept for 4 decades. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and placed the album on her lap, understanding for the first time that what had been moved to the garage was not just furniture and clothing. It was the quiet beginning of being relocated within her own life. The following week unfolded with a kind of careful politeness that made Margaret more uneasy than an open argument ever could. Daniel left early each morning in his pressed shirts and polished shoes, calling out a quick goodbye that sounded practiced. Claire moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, placing organic yogurt cups in the refrigerator and lining up glass storage containers in perfect rows. Margaret began noticing the language they used when speaking about the house. They said our kitchen when discussing the backsplash. They said our backyard when talking about planting shrubs along the fence. When Claire referred to the guest room, she began calling it Margaret's space, as if the rest of the house had already been assigned elsewhere. One afternoon, while Margaret watered the hydrangeas near the front porch, she overheard Claire on the patio speaking softly into her phone. The word listing floated through the open screen door, followed by square footage and market comparison. Margaret did not step closer. She did not interrupt. She simply turned the hose slightly and watched the water pool around the roots, soaking into the soil Thomas had once tilled by hand. That evening at dinner, Daniel mentioned that property values in their Ohio suburb had increased nearly 15% over the past year. He spoke with the calm tone of someone discussing interest rates, not memories. Margaret folded her napkin carefully and asked what that meant for them. Daniel replied that it was just smart to be aware of options. Options. The words settled heavily between the plates. Later, in the quiet of her smaller bedroom, Margaret opened the drawer of her nightstand and took out a manila folder Thomas had given her long ago. He had insisted on keeping important documents organized, each page slipped into a plastic sleeve. She had not examined them closely since the week after the funeral, when the grief felt too thick to allow for practical thinking. Now she sat upright against the headboard, the lamp casting a soft yellow circle of light across the papers. The deed to the house was there, printed in formal type, along with a trust agreement Thomas had created years before his health declined. Margaret read each line slowly, her finger tracing the paragraphs as if following a recipe. The language was clear. The house was held in a trust in her name, with specific instructions about transfer and consent. No sale could occur without her direct authorization. She closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer, not with fear, but with a steadiness that surprised her. The next morning, when Claire suggested clearing additional storage space in the garage to make room for seasonal decorations, Margaret agreed without hesitation. She carried 2 boxes out herself, stacking them neatly against the far wall. From the driveway, the house looked unchanged, its brick facade warm in the late summer sun. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. Everything appeared ordinary. Inside, however, Margaret felt something shift within her, not anger, not panic, but awareness. She began to understand that what was unfolding was not confusion or temporary adjustment. It was a quiet strategy, measured in inches and polite conversations. And for the first time since Thomas had passed, she realized she would need a strategy of her own. 2 days later, Margaret decided to test the quiet boundaries that had begun forming around her. She woke before anyone else, as she always had, and brewed coffee in the same ceramic pot she and Thomas had bought during a road trip to Vermont. The kitchen was still dim, the digital clock on the oven glowing 5:30 in soft green numbers. She carried her mug to the dining room and sat at the head of the table, the seat she had occupied for nearly 4 decades. When Claire entered an hour later, dressed for a morning fitness class, she paused for half a second before offering a polite smile. "I did not know you were up so early," Claire said, her voice light but edged with surprise. Margaret returned the smile and replied that she had always risen with the sun. She remained seated, hands folded around the warm mug, as Daniel came downstairs adjusting his watch. He hesitated briefly when he saw her at the head of the table, then chose the chair to her right instead of the one Thomas used to take at her left. The arrangement felt subtle, almost invisible, yet it carried meaning. Over breakfast, Daniel mentioned that a real estate agent had stopped by the previous afternoon to drop off a comparative market analysis for homes in their neighborhood. He explained that it was only informational, nothing more. Margaret listened carefully, noting the confidence in his tone, as if decisions had already begun forming beyond her reach. She asked simple questions about the figures, about recent sales on their street, about average time on the market. Daniel answered readily, unaware that each number confirmed what she had suspected. After he left for work, Margaret walked through the house slowly, measuring the space with her eyes. The living room rug had been rotated. The hallway mirror had been replaced with a larger, more modern frame. Even the scent in the air had changed, replaced by a candle labeled clean linen that Claire favored. In the garage, Margaret examined the boxes again, this time not as a displaced owner, but as someone taking inventory. She noticed that certain items were missing from the stack, including a small wooden jewelry case Thomas had carved for her on their 30th anniversary. She returned inside and asked Claire about it in a calm, steady voice. Claire explained that she had moved a few things upstairs to make decluttering easier. Decluttering. Margaret repeated the word silently. That afternoon, she drove her silver sedan to the bank and requested printed statements for the past 6 months. The teller recognized her and asked kindly how she had been holding up. Margaret responded with measured warmth, explaining that she was reviewing paperwork. From there she continued to a law office downtown, a modest brick building she and Thomas had visited years before. She did not go inside yet. She simply parked across the street and looked at the brass plaque bearing the attorney's name, committing it to memory. When she returned home, Daniel and Claire were discussing paint samples spread across the kitchen counter. They stopped when she entered, as if mid-sentence. Margaret glanced at the pale gray swatches and commented that the house had always looked beautiful in its original shade. Daniel smiled tightly and said that change could be refreshing. Margaret nodded, but inside she recognized the pattern more clearly than ever. The changes were no longer suggestions. They were preparations. And for the first time, she felt not displaced, but alert, as if a long-dormant instinct had quietly awakened the following Sunday. Margaret attended church alone for the first time since Daniel had moved back into the house. She chose her usual pew near the center aisle, the one she and Thomas had occupied for years, and listened as the choir's voices rose toward the wooden rafters. The familiar hymns steadied her breathing. After the service, several longtime friends approached with gentle questions about how she was adjusting to having family under the same roof again. Margaret smiled and offered careful answers, saying that it was an adjustment. That change always required patience. She did not mention the boxes in the garage. She did not mention the word listing. When she returned home, she found Daniel and Claire seated at the kitchen island with a laptop open between them. Spreadsheets filled the screen, rows of numbers arranged with neat precision. Daniel looked up and said they were reviewing household expenses to make sure everything was efficient. Margaret placed her purse on the counter and asked if there was something specific they needed from her. Claire replied that it would help if Margaret consolidated some of her accounts, perhaps simplifying things for the future. The phrase for the future carried a tone that felt less like inclusion and more like preparation. That afternoon, Margaret went upstairs to the guest room and retrieved the manila folder again. She spread the documents across the small desk by the window and began making notes in a lined notebook Thomas had once used for garden plans. She wrote down account numbers, dates, and clauses from the trust agreement, copying them carefully in her steady handwriting. As she reviewed the language, she noticed a provision she had overlooked before, one that specified that any attempt to transfer or encumber the property without her written consent would automatically nullify occupancy rights granted to others residing in the home. The words were clear, unambiguous, and firm. Margaret felt a quiet clarity settle over her. Later that evening, she joined Daniel and Claire for dinner, as usual. The conversation centered on paint colors again, then shifted to the possibility of staging certain rooms to make the space feel more open. Margaret listened without interruption, then asked a single question about whether they had spoken to an attorney before taking steps towards selling a property held in trust. The fork in Daniel's hand paused midair. Claire glanced at him quickly before responding that they were only exploring options. Margaret nodded, her expression calm, and mentioned that she had reviewed the trust documents that morning. She did not elaborate further. After dinner, she washed her own plate and set it carefully in the drying rack. As she walked past the hallway mirror, she caught her reflection and noticed something she had not seen in months. Her shoulders were no longer slightly hunched from uncertainty. They were squared, steady, as if remembering a posture she had once carried effortlessly. In the quiet of her room, she placed the manila folder back into the drawer, this time not as a source of comfort, but as a tool. The house was still, the evening air cool beyond the window. Margaret understood that the next move would not require raised voices or dramatic gestures. It would require timing, precision, and the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood on Tuesday morning. Margaret left the house earlier than usual, her movements deliberate but unhurried. She wore a tailored navy blazer she had not taken out of the closet in months, and fastened the small pearl earrings Thomas had given her on their 20th anniversary. The choice was not about appearance. It was about memory, about stepping into a version of herself that once handled insurance paperwork, school registrations, and mortgage negotiations without hesitation. She drove downtown to the brick law office she had studied from across the street days before. This time she parked directly in front and walked inside. The waiting room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. When the receptionist asked how she could help, Margaret gave her full name and mentioned the trust created under her late husband's estate. Within 30 minutes, she was seated across from attorney Michael Harper, a man in his early 50s with silver at his temples and a calm, attentive expression. Margaret placed the manila folder on his desk and explained the recent discussions in her home, careful to describe events without emotion, only facts. She outlined the references to resale value, the comparative market analysis, and the gradual relocation of her belongings. Attorney Harper reviewed the documents slowly, nodding as he read the trust provisions. He confirmed what Margaret already understood. The property was legally protected under her authority, and any attempt to sell or refinance without her written consent would have no standing. He added that if she felt pressure was being applied, there were formal notices that could clarify occupancy rights. Margaret listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not express anger. She asked precise questions about procedure, about timelines, about the language of formal communication. By the end of the meeting, she requested a certified copy of the trust and asked Attorney Harper to prepare a letter outlining her exclusive decision-making authority regarding the house. When she returned home that afternoon, Daniel was in the driveway measuring the width of the garage entrance, jotting numbers into his phone. He looked up, surprised to see her step out of the sedan with steady composure. Claire appeared moments later, carrying a folder of printed listings. They paused when Margaret approached. She greeted them warmly and mentioned that she had spent the morning reviewing important documents to ensure clarity for everyone involved. Daniel forced a small smile and said that clarity was always helpful. Margaret agreed and added that she valued transparency within a family. She did not reveal the details of her meeting. She did not raise her voice. That evening, after dinner, she placed a sealed envelope on the hallway console table where mail was usually sorted. The envelope bore the letterhead of Harper and Associates. She did not announce its contents. She simply walked past it and retired to her room. From downstairs, she later heard the faint rustle of paper being opened and the subtle shift in tone between Daniel and Claire as they read. Margaret sat at her desk, hands resting calmly on the wood surface, aware that the balance within the house had begun to tilt, not through confrontation, but through quiet documentation and deliberate timing. The atmosphere in the house shifted the morning after the letter was opened. Margaret noticed it in the quiet way Daniel avoided lingering in the kitchen and in the careful tone Claire used when asking whether she wanted more coffee. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, only a new layer of caution woven into ordinary routines. The envelope that had rested on the console table the night before was gone, but its presence seemed to remain in the air like a faint scent. Margaret moved through the house with steady composure, pausing in the living room to adjust a picture frame that had been angled toward a newer photograph. She turned it back to its original position without comment. At breakfast, Daniel cleared his throat and said that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about their intentions. He explained that they were only trying to think ahead, to plan responsibly. Margaret listened, her hands folded neatly on the table. She replied that planning was wise, and that clarity protected everyone involved. Her voice was calm, neither defensive nor accusatory. Claire added that they had not realized the legal structure of the property was so specific. Margaret responded that the structure had been designed that way years ago, with careful thought and mutual agreement. She did not mention Attorney Harper by name. She did not need to. Later that afternoon, Margaret drove to the storage facility a few miles away and rented a small climate-controlled unit, 10 feet by 10 feet, just large enough for personal keepsakes and documents. She did not intend to move out. The unit was not an escape plan. It was a safeguard. She transferred a few irreplaceable items from the garage into her car, including the wooden jewelry case and the anniversary scrapbook. As she placed them carefully into the storage space, she felt a quiet sense of order returning to her life. Back at the house, Daniel was seated at the dining table reviewing the certified copy of the trust once more. He looked up as she entered and said that perhaps they had rushed certain conversations. Margaret nodded gently and suggested that future discussions be approached with everyone fully informed. That evening, she prepared dinner herself for the first time in months, choosing Thomas's favorite chicken and rice recipe. The aroma filled the kitchen, familiar and grounding. Daniel thanked her sincerely. Claire complimented the seasoning. The meal was peaceful, almost reflective. Yet beneath the surface, the roles had shifted. Margaret was no longer the uncertain widow adjusting to shared space. She was the legal authority of the home, fully aware of her rights and prepared to exercise them if necessary. As she washed the dishes and dried them carefully, she observed Daniel and Claire speaking in low voices near the patio door. Their expressions were thoughtful, measured. Margaret did not strain to hear. She did not need to know every word. She had already altered the direction of the conversation without raising her volume. For the first time since the boxes appeared in the garage, the house felt balanced again, not because tension had disappeared, but because control had quietly returned to its rightful place by the end of the week. The careful politeness inside the house had evolved into something more structured. Daniel requested a formal conversation on Saturday afternoon, suggesting they sit together at the dining table without distractions. Margaret agreed immediately and chose her usual seat at the head of the table. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting narrow lines across the polished wood surface Thomas had refinished years earlier. Claire placed a folder in front of Daniel, but this time there were no glossy listing sheets, no paint samples, no casual remarks about market trends. Daniel began by acknowledging that they had underestimated the legal clarity surrounding the property. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with visible care, explaining that their intention had been long-term planning, not displacement. Margaret listened without interruption, her posture upright, hands resting lightly in her lap. When he finished, she thanked him for recognizing the importance of transparency. She then outlined her expectations with calm precision. The house would remain under her sole authority. Any future discussions about financial planning would occur only after full disclosure and mutual agreement. Personal belongings would be returned to their original spaces unless she chose otherwise. Claire nodded, her expression measured but restrained. There was no apology, yet there was an understanding that the balance had shifted permanently. Margaret did not accuse them of manipulation. She did not reference the boxes directly. Instead, she spoke about legacy, about promises made between spouses, about stability in uncertain seasons of life. Her voice carried neither bitterness nor triumph, only certainty. After the conversation ended, Daniel offered to reorganize the garage. Margaret accepted the offer without comment. Later that afternoon, she watched from the kitchen window as he carried boxes back inside. placing them carefully against the hallway wall. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost symbolic. Claire joined him quietly, lifting lighter cartons and setting them down without complaint. Inside the house, Margaret returned the wedding photograph to the living room mantel, positioning it exactly where it had stood for decades. The frame caught the afternoon light, reflecting a soft glow across the room. That evening, she walked through each space at her own pace. The master bedroom door, once renamed informally, was left slightly open, as if waiting for her direction. She did not reclaim it immediately. She allowed the moment to settle. In the guest room, now partially restored, she placed the manila folder back into the drawer and closed it gently. The trust, the letter, the quiet meeting downtown had not created conflict. They had clarified boundaries. At dinner, the conversation was subdued but respectful. Daniel asked about her church group. Claire inquired whether she needed help organizing the storage unit. Margaret answered with steady warmth. She understood that authority did not require harshness. It required consistency. As night fell over the quiet suburban street, the house no longer felt like a structure in transition. It felt anchored again. Margaret stood for a moment in the hallway, listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a passing car. Control had not returned through argument. It had returned through composure, documentation, and the refusal to surrender space that had been built over 40 years of shared life. Several weeks passed, and the rhythm of the house settled into something steady and unmistakably defined. Margaret resumed small routines that had once belonged to her alone. On Saturday mornings, she placed fresh flowers in a glass vase at the center of the dining table, trimming the stems to exactly 8 inches the way Thomas preferred. She adjusted the thermostat to a temperature that felt comfortable to her, not excessively cool, not overly warm, simply balanced. Daniel and Claire moved carefully within those rhythms, no longer speaking in terms of resale value or renovation plans. Instead, conversations focused on daily schedules, grocery lists, and ordinary matters. The shift was subtle but permanent. One evening, Daniel approached Margaret in the living room where she was sorting through old photographs. He told her that he and Claire had begun looking at townhouses closer to his office, explaining that the commute from the suburb added nearly 40 minutes each day. His tone was respectful, almost reflective. Margaret listened without surprise. She nodded and said that convenience was important in this stage of their lives. There was no accusation in her voice, no triumph, only acknowledgement. Over the next 2 weeks, the garage cleared gradually. Boxes were removed not because they belonged there, but because Daniel and Claire were preparing to leave. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as a moving truck eventually backed into the driveway. The scene felt different from the quiet displacement she had experienced earlier. This time, nothing of hers was being relocated. The house stood unchanged, bricks solid and steady against the late autumn sky. When the final items were loaded, Daniel walked back up the driveway and stood before her on the front porch. He thanked her for her patience and admitted that he had allowed practicality to overshadow sentiment. Margaret placed a hand lightly on his arm and told him that homes were not only investments. They were anchors. Claire offered a measured smile and said she hoped they could visit often. Margaret replied that the door would always be open when respect walked in with them. After the truck pulled away, silence settled over the property once more. Margaret stepped back inside and closed the front door gently. The hallway felt wider, the air lighter. She walked into the living room and adjusted the wedding photograph on the mantel, ensuring it faced forward, centered. Then she made her way to the master bedroom and opened the door fully. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating the polished wood dresser and the neatly made bed. She stood there for a long moment, not overwhelmed, not tearful, simply present. The house no longer felt uncertain or negotiated. It felt claimed. Later that evening, Margaret brewed a cup of tea and sat at the dining table alone, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustle of leaves outside. The future did not feel empty. It felt self-directed. The foundation beneath her had never truly shifted. It had only required her to stand firmly upon it. And as night settled across the suburban street, Margaret understood that